Hello, and welcome to the second in our series of seminars on the subject of GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulations that are coming into force in the European market on the 25th of May next year. My name is Andy Burton. I'm the Chief Executive of Tryzens, and I'm joined by Nick Mathis, a partner of White & Black, a law firm that we're working with in this area. For those of you that may have listened to the first webinar, this is going to pick up the conversation from a point of view of looking at the operational priorities that are facing retailers in order to be able to demonstrate compliance and readiness for GDPR when it comes into force. We're going to do a little bit of a recap up front to summarize where we got to in the last episode, and then I will hand over to Nick, and he will take us through an amount of detail to help understand the opportunities around marketing and e-commerce, and then looking at a risk-based approach about how we would recommend retailers prepare themselves for the inevitable implications of what GDPR will mean for them. But by way of a recap, first of all, let's look at, well, exactly what is GDPR. So first of all, it is, at the end of the day, an intention across the European Union to have a single policy, regulation, law in place that enables two primary purposes. The first thing is focusing on the data subject, the consumer, as far as we're concerned as retailers. The aim of this new regulation is to ensure that the rights of EU citizens are protected in a world that is increasingly dependent on the digital marketplace. There are lots of stories out there about how information can be compromised and people can be have their images spoofed and the like. The aim of GDPR is to ensure that data that is collected about us as individuals is protected and looked after and used for lawful purposes. But it's equally there to recognize that the digital economy is high growth, and therefore to provide a mechanism for organizations that are trading within the European Union to ensure that they have an understanding that there's a consistent approach that's due to be taken. So this policy, this regulation comes into force on the 25th of May next year. That said, it's already adopted by the nations in the EU, and therefore to all intents and purposes should be considered law, albeit compliance only needs to be demonstrated formally from May of 2018. And just to be crystal clear, GDPR is not impacted by Brexit. The UK government are signed up to this. It will become enforced within the UK market by the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office. So we should always understand that GDPR is not in any shape or form impacted by some of the broader political issues that are going on in the marketplace. Now, to be clear, there is another level of regulation that is in earlier stages of drafting at the moment in time, which is referred to as e-privacy. E-privacy focuses on some of the more modern digital arenas, such as cookies, so browsing behaviors and the like, and email communications, and therefore has more focus on the marketing activities. And within this area becomes the conflict that sometimes when we are looking at e-commerce or retail in the modern digital age, that sometimes we're focusing on a marketing activity, sometimes we're focusing on enabling people to purchase and then fulfill an order through to the customer's address. So sometimes we'll be talking about GDPR, and we'll be clear as we can be about the impact of GDPR on those processes. Other times we have to be cognizant of the fact that there is new e-privacy regulation coming on that will update some of the impact that we see around marketing behaviors, but probably within a timeline of 12 to 18 months after GDPR comes into force. So with that in mind, what I'd like to do then is think about, first of all, that GDPR is, at its heart, principles-based. What that means is that we do not have a blueprint that we can give to you today that says if you follow this plan, you will definitely be seen to be compatible with, compliant to GDPR. It has to be interpreted. Every organization, therefore, has to go through a process of assessing the risk within their own operations, understanding the data about the individuals that's being captured, understanding whether that data is necessary for the performance of the activities that they are carrying out, and ensuring there are appropriate protections in place for that data through data security measures, but also, and more importantly, that you can, as a retailer, demonstrate that additional rights that are being made available to these consumers, such as the right to be forgotten, the right to be informed, these kinds of things need to be able to be delivered in the processes that your organization operate. We will explain that in more detail as we go through, but it's important just to bear in mind that even though the Data Protection Act, which has fulfilled a lot of our or I should say outlines a lot of our responsibilities over the last decade or so, most of that is encapsulated within GDPR, but the things that have changed the most, arguably, are around new rights that digital citizens have in this modern age, and therefore puts a pressure on organizations such as retailers in terms of the processes that they must be able to operate and demonstrate in order to uphold the rights of those digital citizens. So, moving on then. When we met last time, we were talking about the basis under which we would carry out activity with personal data. And GDPR recognizes 6 principles of lawful processing, 3 of which are very relevant to the conversations around the retail community. We would argue that the 2 most important areas for e-commerce are the performance of a contract. If you are going to a website to purchase something, you will need to provide information about yourself to enable that order to be fulfilled, not least your name and your delivery address. So signing up for a new account, if you have clients that are going to be regular users of your site, naturally that could be seen as a performance of a contract because you're asking for information about them that will enable you to offer your services that your account may offer to them, whether it's includes loyalty programs, whether it includes certain basic profile information, what gender they are, maybe what age they are, maybe any interests that they have that might be relevant to the products that you will serve. Therefore, you have a requirement to capture that information to perform the obligation of enabling them to sign up for that account. The second one we'd say is very relevant is legitimate interest. You cannot take an order and fulfill it if you don't have a delivery address. So capturing certain information is critical to the process of you being able to perform the work that you're doing. So performance of a contract and legitimate interest go quite hand in hand in that process of someone consciously wanting to sign up for an account or order products. And if they're ordering products just as a guest account, so they're going through a guest checkout, then obviously you'd largely rely on what we would call legitimate interest to say, well, we can't fulfill the order unless you provide us that information. The area which is arguably the most controversial and has been the most opaque over recent years is the issue of consent. We're very well aware in the current e-privacy regulations around the rules around cookies, around the rules around opt-in for email campaigns, and that is going to continue to crystallize as the e-privacy regulations come up to speed with the latest version of GDPR. And as I say, over the course of the next couple of years, we'll hopefully see those harmonize. But right now, even in an e-commerce environment, we would say that it's essential that you're able to demonstrate consent, i.e. the fact that a consumer has explicitly and consciously said, yes, you may have data for certain purposes, where we talk about special natures of or special classes of data. So, for example, religious belief, trade union membership, sexual orientation, things that are naturally personal and private to that individual that may be essential for certain programs, depending on the type of products that you're selling, etc., but aren't normal classes of data that you may not actually need consent for. But for marketing, where it comes down to are you able to communicate with people, then the new rules around consent say that you must have this consent unbundled. It must be explicitly stated the purpose for which you are capturing the data and you're wishing to market them for, and they must be consenting to that individually. And if you're going to ask for consent for email as well as, for argument's sake, SMS messaging, then you must get those separate consents in place. But you must also evidence that the consent is valid, that it was freely given, and then you can evidence when it was given. So the rules around consent are quite high. And on this chart, what we try to do is exemplify the fact that if it's coded green, then we're sort of saying these kinds of lawful processing methods apply. So for e-commerce, we're saying, performance of a contract, legitimate interest should be your primary purpose. Consent within e-commerce we see as being primarily related to special classes of data, but marketing activity should always be subject to consent, but the current policies in place around soft opt-in and activities like that for marketing still apply. So the devil is in the detail. There are three other classes of lawful processing, a compliance obligation. So you have to do it because of your responsibilities in industry, or there might be public interest, or there might be vital interest, such as your blood type might need to be known in a medical emergency situation. Clearly, those three options are less relevant in a retail environment. So lawful processing, the basis under which I capture personal data in the first place, we would definitely focus to those first three. Obviously, then you have to get into the nature of what is fair processing, and that's the other topic that we covered in the previous webinar. Now, if you were in our live seminar, we will be showing you examples now of how you might approach the concept of fair process notices, otherwise known as privacy policies. The guidance that's given in the market interpretation of GDPR at this moment in time is that it is better to inform people the use of to which you're going to put their data at the point you're asking to capture it. So we do have some worked examples of what that may look like. In the interest of keeping this webinar version of our content tight, we're not going to break out into those examples here and now, but at the end of this webinar, you'll see our contact details. And if you'd like to run through some worked examples of what does a fair process notice look like, how can you weave it into a customer journey, and what does consent need to look like for normal and special data classes, then we have worked examples we can share with you, and please do contact us for that purpose. So at the end of the last workshop, what we ended up with, the position was, look, GDPR is here to stay. It comes into force in May next year. There is a difference in requirements today still between e-commerce operations generally and marketing activity, and that you need to focus on the lawful processing mechanisms of performance of the contract, legitimate interest, and only use consent where ultimately necessary, and that explicitly relates to marketing. What I'd like to do now is hand over to Nick, and we're going to go into a little bit more depth, first of all on marketing to understand the impact of the e-privacy regulations, but then more specifically to say, okay, well, if that's what's required, if these are the new things that are coming in around digital citizen rights and the like, then what is it that we as a retail organization would need to do to prepare ourselves to ensure that we can demonstrate compliance and therefore avoid some of the risk that's been raised about the significant levels of new fines that can come into play that are at the control of the ICO. So we want to avoid the FUD and focus on the facts and the best practices that we can deploy. So with that in mind, Nick, if I may hand over to you, we'll start off with a look at marketing and e-privacy.
Thank you, Andy. So I'd like to consider really what preparing for GDPR means from a marketing perspective and the extent to which the lawful basis of processing, which Andy's just touched on, maybe impacts the rights which consumers have under the GDPR. So firstly, preparing for GDPR also means preparing for changes in the e-privacy regulations. As Andy's mentioned, since the early 2000s, we have had e-privacy regulations sitting alongside the Data Protection Act to regulate the processing of personal data in an electronic context, including in relation to direct marketing. Now that the GDPR has been finalised, the EU bodies are turning their attention to bringing the e-privacy regulations up to date and to aligning them with GDPR. And what that means is aligning the fines for breaches of e-privacy regulations, which are going to be brought up to the same high fines that you will see under GDPR, and also aligning it in terms of how the law will be enforced and definitions and enforcement bodies. The reason that this is very important for retailers is that most retailers will be engaging regularly in direct marketing by phone, email, text, fax, for example, and they will be using cookies or similar tracking technologies on their websites and mobile apps. Therefore, they will already be subject to the current e-privacy regulations and will remain subject to the new e-privacy regulations once they are brought up to GDPR standards. It is a particularly high-risk area for retailers because we see frequent and aggressive ICO enforcement action for breaches of e-privacy regulations. The other core area of enforcement for retailers to be aware of is security breaches, and we'll come on to that later. Now, in terms of the marketing under the GDPR itself, because retailers will have to comply with both the GDPR requirements and the new e-privacy regulations requirements, Under GDPR, clearly consent must be up to the standard, the highest standard, which has already been discussed in the previous webinar. However, this won't in practice represent a need to change significantly current practices for getting consent, because if retailers are complying with the current standards laid out under current e-privacy regulations, these are very similar to what is required under GDPR, which we set out in the slide there, in terms of requiring positive action from your customers and to list out very specifically the different types of marketing which you may ask them to consent to. In terms of timing, whilst the EU bodies are aiming to have the new e-privacy regulations in effect by the GDPR deadline, there is currently very intense negotiation between various bodies in respect of the detail of the e-privacy regulations, and it's looking quite ambitious to have it in place by then. So the time frame which Andy mentioned previously of over the next 2 years seeing the e-privacy regulations coming into effect, at this stage seems a more likely outcome. As we're moving on to the next slide, really we're taking a look at what the e-privacy regulations require retailers to do. Many retailers will be familiar with this because they'll be in compliance with the current laws. The general rules are that you must not send electronic mail marketing, which is a broad definition, includes not just email, but also text, social media, etc., unless the customer specifically requested it, or they have specifically consented to receiving it, or you are relying on soft opt-in, which is where you have an existing customer who bought or negotiated to buy a similar product or service in the past, and you gave them a way to opt out at the time, then you're allowed to continue to contact them in relation to similar goods or services. Under the proposed new e-privacy regulations, the first draft contained a similar soft opt-out provision, but of course this remains to be seen whether or not that will be retained in the final draft, either in the form currently proposed or in a slightly different form. We've also listed on the slide here that this is a very active area of ITO enforcement, and we are currently seeing record levels of fines imposed by the ITO for breaches of unlawful marketing. Lastly, on marketing activity in GDPR, of course, the e-privacy regulations do not just deal with direct marketing, they also lay out regulations to comply in relation to the use of cookies. Retailers will also need to bear this in mind when they are using cookies and other similar tracking technologies on websites and apps. So moving on now to consider to what extent are consumer rights impacted by the lawful basis of processing those three different types, whether it's relying on performance of a contract, legitimate interest, or consent. On this slide, we have simply recapped here the rights of the data subjects under the GDPR for reference. Many of these are building on the existing rights which we have under the current Data Protection Act, such as the right to be informed and the right of access. They look similar to the rights under the Data Protection Act, but the GDPR is much more prescriptive. However, we have some new rights that will have a practical impact on how retailers are processing data, for example, the right to erasure and the right to data portability. And this, again, if we remind ourselves of the core reason for having the GDPR come into effect, really it is to grant your customers and your employees more transparency and more control over how their data is processed, both by yourselves and by any third parties that you engage to process that on your behalf. So really trying to give your customers and employees more power over their data and visibility. So what we've done on the next slide is to list up how the lawful basis for processing may impact which of the rights that your customers can exercise under the GDPR. And as you'll see from the large number of ticks and the very few crosses or qualified crosses in this table, really the assumption for retailers should be that no matter what basis of processing you're relying on, you should assume that your internal procedures and your systems are capable of responding to all of the requests that may be made when individuals exercise their rights under the GDPR. We'll be looking at this from a practical perspective briefly later when we touch on the issue of providers, because clearly it is not simply the legal compliance that is important here, it's making sure that in practice all of your IT systems and e-commerce systems that you have in place, either in-house or those systems that you rely on to be provided by third parties, can allow you as a business to respond to these requests. For example, if one of your customers requests to have certain of their data ported over to another organization or to have it erased, then your systems must be able to accommodate these requests. So what we'd like to do in the next section is to move on and consider how retailers should be structuring their preparations for GDPR using a risk risk-based approach. So as we move on, I'd like to walk you through the approach which we have developed at White and Black to advise our own clients in preparing for GDPR. As Andy mentioned, there is no blueprint, no single correct approach to preparing for GDPR. However, this risk-based approach that we have developed, we have found to be very effective, both for retailers operating at a B2C level or D2C level, and also for B2B companies as well. Clearly, any project needs to be in time, on point, and on budget. And in order for a GDPR preparation project to be successful, clearly it's important to secure top-down buy-in from the board and from key stakeholders. But resources in terms of time and money will always be limited. And so the risk-based approach to prioritise the use of resources, and we'll come on to explore that in more detail, is very important to achieve the same. Clearly, internal and external costs need to be taken into account. And in terms of timing, now that we have around 8 months to prepare for GDPR, it's very important indeed to identify any areas which could take more time to prepare for. For example, renegotiation of long-term IT contracts with third-party suppliers is one area which we have found that it's advisable to start making preparations now to engaging with your suppliers, because these processes can take a considerable amount of time in practice. In terms of creating a data protection culture, ultimately, in order to comply with the GDPR, it is important for everyone in the organisation who comes into contact with personal data, who is responsible for collecting it and processing it, or is responsible for engaging with third parties who will process it on behalf of your organisation, to understand the obligations under the law and to behave in a way that is going to ensure that you remain compliant. This point was emphasised very recently by the ICO Deputy Commissioner in the quote on the slide. And the 3 key points there are that always the risk to the individual needs to be clearly identified and taken into account. GDPR is essentially about creating trust with those individuals whose data you're collecting, and only handling it in a way that they would expect of you. And lastly, it is about changing the culture of an organisation to make sure that the organisations are behaving in a way that will enable compliance and to maintain that relationship of trust. So let's look now at the risk-based approach in more detail. The risk-based approach is embedded in both in the GDPR itself, and has also been frequently encouraged by the regulators in the advice which has been published to date on complying with GDPR. So if we look in the recital 76 there, which is on the slide, clearly whenever you are looking at how you're processing data, the nature of the data, the scope, context and purposes of how you're handling it should always be taken into account to establish, are the operations which you're performing on the data involving a risk or a high risk, because it is those high risk areas where you should be focusing your resources to ensure that the data is handled appropriately and kept safe. The GDPR itself lists out, as we have put in that box, in the box on the slide, the key factors to take into account to determine higher risk processing. So pulling out a few examples from there, clearly the sensitive data, which Andy has mentioned earlier, for example, data relating to religious beliefs, trade union membership, sexual orientation, can present a very high risk to the individual if, for example, it was leaked or stolen and needs to be treated as a high risk operation. Similarly, any data which you collect in relation to children or other vulnerable persons, or information which could be used to undertake identity theft or fraud, that type of information needs to be identified and prioritised in the GDPR preparation project. And if we look at the quote from the recent guidance on data protection officers issued by the EU advisory body on data protection, the Article 29 Working Party, it's encouraging all organisations to prioritise their activities and focus their efforts in preparing for GDPR on those activities which present higher data protection risks. So if we move on now to look at how might a retailer actually prepare in practice for GDPR coming to effect, we have found that a 4-stage approach can help to break down the different work streams and provide a very practical framework for preparing for next May. The first stage clearly will be the planning session. This is really about trying to obtain clarity on what types of data processing activities are undertaken within your organisation and what risks they may pose. As part of this, we would also this planning stage, we would recommend, if it has not already been undertaken, to ensure that key stakeholders and the management have an awareness of GDPR and that they agree that you have buy-in from the management and key stakeholders to roll out the project. The next stage will be to actually undertake a data audit, sometimes known as data mapping, in order to actually identify in more detail what data processing operations are taking place within the retailer. This may be undertaken by way of interviews, for example, with department heads. It may be undertaken with software mapping to map certain types of data operations. Also, it will involve a process of due diligence in reviewing key documents, whether that's privacy notices or supplier contracts, but also other areas such as the employee handbook. The third stage will be to analyse the output of the data audit and to formulate organisation recommendations both at an organisational level and at a departmental level. It may also be necessary to analyse whether you specifically require a data protection officer, and if any particularly high-risk activities are identified, then you need to consider whether to undertake a privacy impact assessment. The fourth and very important stage will be to start to implement the recommendations from the analysis stage. Often the first key stage in this will be to raise awareness across the organisation through a series of structured training sessions on GDPR and what it means in practice to actually allow those individuals in the organisation who are processing personal data daily to be able to ensure that data is protected and only processed for the purposes that it was obtained for. There will also be a stage of revising and preparing materials, whether that is privacy notices, data retention checklists, for example, breach notification policies. It may also be necessary to engage third parties, such as suppliers of core e-commerce and IT systems, if it's discovered during the data audit that the need to have GDPR compliant processing agreements in place with such suppliers. And the final point on the slide here is that throughout the two-year transition phase for GDPR to come into effect, we are seeing an increasing amount of guidance being issued. And so it will be important to take into account this guidance as your GDPR project continues. On the next slide, we have set out an example of what a data audit might look like for a typical retailer. And so if we break it down into the four areas here of identifying core processing, this will be looking at, for example, not just the customer-facing data processing, such as customer account creation and order fulfillment and marketing, but also looking internally within the organization to how employee-related data or recruitment-related data is collected and processed. In terms of the core departments that will need to be involved in the GDPR project, again, there will be a mixture of outward-looking and inward-looking departments, depending on the types of data processing. In terms of customer-facing, clearly those departments responsible for e-commerce and sales and marketing will be very important. But internally, again, the HR department and the procurement and IT department are often very important in terms of the GDPR project. The types of data that retailers typically are collecting and processing, again, there is the customer-facing data, both data provided by the customers, but also collected, for example, through using cookies and tracking technologies and websites, and internally from employees and recruits and, for example, contacts at suppliers. And in the final box there, in terms of identifying suppliers and international data transfers, this is an area which we frequently find in the data audit. It will reveal areas where there will need to be agreements put in place or renegotiated with core suppliers, and it's very important to get a clear picture on where the data is being stored and transferred, because frequently, with the use of cloud-based services, personal data of your customers and employees will be stored and transferred in countries outside the EU, and additional steps will need to be taken to make sure that those transfers are lawful. I'd now like to move on to consider the other high-risk area in terms of enforcement, which must be taken into account when you're adopting a risk-based approach to prepare for GDPR. That area is security, which together with unlawful marketing forms one of the key areas of aggressive and frequent enforcement action by the ICO. Now, the principle that personal data must be protected using appropriate technical and organizational measures should be familiar to retailers, because it's a core principle under the current Data Protection Act and will remain a core principle under the GDPR. The key difference, of course, being that the magnitude of fines for example, which may be levied for breach of this core obligation, will be much higher under the GDPR. In terms of technical and organisational measures, retailers are often asking what in practice do they need to do in order to satisfy this obligation. There is currently detailed guidance available from the ICO in respect of the Data Protection Act, which will be equally applicable to the GDPR. And this is effectively saying that each organisation will need to analyse and decide for itself what appropriate security measures will be. However, if the retailer looks at some of the mistakes which other organisations have made, for example, the ICO has published a guide there, it identifies some of the technical issues which frequently give rise to security breaches that have been enforced by the ICO. We've listed those on the slide. We'd recommend that all retailers would review this guidance and discuss it with their own IT teams to make sure that these types of areas will be well covered technically. In terms of organisational measures, here we're talking about procedures within a retailer's organisation that should be in place to ensure that data is handled appropriately and kept secure. This ranges from designating responsible persons within the organisation to ensure that there is compliance with the accountability principle under the GDPR, and that if any issues arise, then the ICO is able to quickly identify who they should be engaging with in order to mitigate any risks flowing from, for example, a security breach. Creating a data protection culture is very important. This has been emphasised time and again by the ICO in their guidance, and clearly one of the organisational measures that all organisations should be taking to prepare for GDPR is to roll out training programs to make sure that everyone in the organisation who is responsible for data processing has an understanding of the obligations under the GDPR and understand how they should be behaving in practice to ensure the data is kept safe. We put as under organisational measures reviewing data retention policies, and I think it's important to understand the relationship between the security principle and two of the other core principles under GDPR, which are data minimisation and data limitation, which we've set out on the next slide. So just to remind ourselves, under GDPR, we have the data minimisation principle, which is that personal data should be adequate, relevant and limited to what is necessary for the purposes for which it is processed. In summary, retailers should not be collecting personal data from their customers just in case they need it. They should only be collecting what is necessary in order to perform the contract which has been required. And typically that would be, for example, supplying goods online or in store, for example. If we look at the storage limitation principle under the GDPR, this is saying that personal data should be kept in a form which permits identification of the individual for no longer than is necessary. And the relationship between the security principle and these two principles of data minimization and storage limitation has been shown to be an issue in practice time and again where there have been security breaches. Because where there has been a security breach and personal data which is collected and processed by a retailer has been put at risk, for example, by a cyber attack, if that retailer has been collecting too much data in the first place and has not been systematically and periodically deleting data that they no longer need, then clearly the magnitude of that cyber attack, for example, the number of individuals who may potentially be put at risk, will be greater. And so we've seen in practice from the ICO that they will see that collecting too much data and not deleting it when it's no longer required is an aggravating factor when they're determining the level of fines to be issued for a security breach. There was recently a case against Boomerang, online video rental company, and we've included a quote from the ICO there. There's the fifth data protection principle, which is the storage limitation principle, was contravened by Boomerang Video because they had retained encrypted cardholder data and CVV numbers on the web server for longer than was necessary. In terms of practical steps to minimize risk for retailers, clearly, again, staff awareness is very important, internal training programs, and creating and implementing data retention policies. Sometimes it is not clear for an organisation whether or not they will need to retain personal data in future, and if there is a question mark as to whether that data may be needed, and the retailer believes that it could continue to have lawful grounds to retain that data, but they do not immediately need it, then consideration should be given as to whether that data could be, for example, archived in a secure way, which would temporarily anonymise the data and ensure that it was safer in the event of a cyber attack or similar security incident. And lastly, in relation to this area, I would like to quickly summarize a recent example of enforcement action against TalkTalk in order to show how the ICO will actually approach a security incident in practice. In summary, from 2004, TalkTalk had outsourced certain services for resolving complaints and network connectivity to Wipro, a global IT services provider. Wipro had a team of around 40 employees who had access to TalkTalk's web portal with account details of up to 50,000 TalkTalk customers, and there were no controls in place to limit access by anyone within that Wipro team. So anyone within the team of 40 Wipro employees could access from anywhere in the world any of those TalkTalk customer details. In September 2014, so 10 years after Wipro had started to provide these services, certain customers at TalkTalk had received scam calls which were quoting their addresses and their telephone numbers from their TalkTalk accounts. These customers contacted TalkTalk to highlight their concerns. An investigation was carried out by TalkTalk into this, and it was uncovered that 3 of the Wipro employees had misused their access to around 21,000 customer details. Those details would be potentially useful to scammers and fraudsters. However, there was actually no link proven to those scam calls which were reported by the TalkTalk customers. Nevertheless, the ICO imposed a fine of £100,000 onto TalkTalk for not ensuring that the processes which it had in place for Wipro's access to its systems were appropriate to ensure security of the data. And this followed on from a previous record fine of £400,000, which the ICO had imposed on TalkTalk for another security breach the previous year. The key point for retailers to take away here is that firstly, that you will be responsible for any security breaches caused by your third-party providers who are processing data on your behalf. And secondly, that the ICO, in these types of circumstances, will come in and they will conduct a broad audit of your data processing operations. They will take into account mitigating factors, such as the fact that you may have self-reported the ICO and been cooperative and may have taken steps to notify customers and help them to mitigate risks. But they will also take into account aggravating factors, for example, if too much data has been retained, or if the organization had sufficient resources to put in place appropriate technical and security measures, but failed to do so. Finally, to wrap up, we would like to briefly look at 2 core areas which are going to form the focus of the 3rd webinar on preparing for GDPR. And these 2 areas relate to mitigating risk from third parties. So we've touched throughout this session on the importance of ensuring that you engage appropriate suppliers to process data, and we've touched very briefly on the requirement to ensure that any transfers of data outside the EEA, the European Economic Area, will be in compliance with the GDPR. So today I'd just like to look a little bit more detail at the issue of third-party suppliers and data transfers to prepare the ground for the 3rd webinar. So firstly, third-party processors. The key point here is that any third-party organization which you engage to process personal data on behalf of your organization will remain your responsibility and your liability. So the position under the current Data Protection Act, which will be maintained under the GDPR, is that all retailers will be responsible third-party processors, and examples of this for a retailer would include, for example, any third-party providers of e-commerce software and services who are involved in the processing of customer data, and any providers of internal software and services in respect of employee data. You will need to have a written agreement with all of your providers who are processing personal data on your behalf, which must include mandatory provisions. Under the GDPR, these mandatory provisions will be much more detailed and onerous. A retailer cannot outsource its regulatory liability and will remain liable for any breaches caused by the process, both to the regulator in terms of fines and other enforcement actions, and also to the individuals themselves in terms of potential civil claims. The GDPR will impose more onerous contractual requirements, but it will also make processors for the first time directly liable under the law and directly liable for potential claims from individuals, as we've sought to represent diagrammatically on this slide. If we move on now to briefly look at the area of data transfers, it will be important for all retailers to ensure that under GDPR, as is the position under the current Data Protection Act, that the entire chain of data processing, from the point at which it comes into your organization, from customers and employees, for example, remains processed in a way which is compliant even if it's transferred outside the European Economic Area. And so the position under the Data Protection Act and under the GDPR is that transferring personal data outside the European Economic Area will remain restricted unless the personal data is transferred to a country on the so-called white list of 11 countries which are deemed to offer adequate protection for the purposes of EU data protection law, or, for example, if it's to the United States, then a US company which is registered with Privacy Shield. If the personal data will not be transferred to a whitelist country or to a US Privacy Shield company, then it will be necessary to take appropriate safeguards, for example, to put in place data transfer agreements which incorporate the EU-approved model clauses. And if that is not possible, then it will be necessary to consider whether a derogation under the law may be relied on. Under the current law, it is very common for retailers to rely in their online terms and conditions privacy notices to obtain the individual's consent. This will remain potentially possible under the GDPR, although consent itself will need to be obtained in a manner which is compliant with the high standards of GDPR. But it should be noted that, for example, it's not possible to rely on consent when you're processing employee data. This is a particularly complex and evolving area of EU data protection law, and so will be looked at in more detail in the third webinar in this series. So that's a very brief run through in terms of what's coming in the third webinar. I will now hand you back to Andy to summarise the position under some of the issues that we've been covering in this webinar.
Thanks for that, Nick. That's really helpful. So we've covered a lot of detail in a very short period of time, as is necessary in these webinars. But the 6 points we'd like you to take away from today's conversation is, first of all, that there are two parallel regulations, one more clearly evolved, which is the GDPR that we talked about and its impact upon e-commerce very specifically, but there is the parallel track coming along behind it of e-privacy. For those of you that are responsible for marketing, will have to bear in mind more activity in regard to the process of consent for marketing activity. So first of all, be aware that even though GDPR is the hot topic, e-privacy is quickly following behind. Secondarily, it's important that when we look at the processes that are in place, that they need to be both fair and lawful. And as I explained earlier, if you would like to contact us to see examples of how fair processing notices and consent of the obtaining and management of consent should be done in an online user experience, we have mocked up examples of that we can share with you. But equally, when you are moving into the lawful processing, then we're saying e-commerce should be, as far as is possible, driven by the principles of performance of a contract and legitimate interest, and try to avoid consent as far as is possible, other than for specific data classes or indeed for marketing and communications. The third element we raised with you is the fact that there are all these new rights for data subjects or digital citizens or consumers, whichever language you'd like to use. And as Nick touched upon those, they probably have the single biggest impact on your internal operating procedures to ensure that those rights can be operationalized within your organizations. So being aware of them, and whether they are automated processes or human processes, then you just need to make sure that they are clearly known and understood and executable within your organization, which will be as much a planning as it is a training and execution issue. To that end, we believe all retailers must take a risk-based approach, because this is such far-reaching policy and regulation. You need to understand the relevance in terms of what data do you capture, how long do you retain it for, what purposes do you use it for, what security do you have in place, and what processes do you need to have in place to support the consumers that use your services. So taking Nick's guidance there on a risk-based approach. And then, as Nick started to touch on in the end, and we will focus in great depth on the third and final formal webinar in the series. We'll be looking at the role of third parties, because they are commonplace. A typical e-commerce site will have over 10 third parties, ranging from hosting companies to the e-commerce platform itself, to content solutions, to personalization solutions, to payment gateways. They all represent data processor style responsibilities that we must take into account. So we'll look at how they should be contracted, and to ensure that they're back to back, because your organizations, being the retailer, are the data controller. You're ultimately responsible for the actions of your data processor. Therefore, you must make sure that the two do align. And therefore, to pull all of that together, to have a clear plan, you do need a clear owner. Maybe not a data protection officer in the full sense of the phrase that GDPR talks about, but you certainly need clear accountability within the organization that can take instruction from the board, can create the plan, execute the plan with the relevant parties within the organization, and make sure everyone's trained. So to that end, having that clear owner in place is probably the first key step. So with that in mind, that's our quick synopsis of the operational implications for GDPR on retail. Please stay tuned for the third in the series. In the meantime, if you would like any information on the content that we've covered, then Nick and I are available to you based on the contact details here. So on behalf of Nick and myself, thank you very much for your time and attention. We hope to catch up with you on the next version.